Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a channel that, holy cow, it's less than a year old and it has 112,000 subscribers. Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. I'm an apologetics ministry now. God is real, because how can you have time, space, and matter come into existence at the same time without an all-powerful creator causing that to happen? Nailing it. Wow, that's a lot easier than actually having to look stuff up.
Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about something that's very interesting and one of the questions that most of us have.
When am I going to convince my wife that a threesome is a good idea?
It is, does God really exist?
Oh, well that's boring.
Now we ask this question because if God really exists, then it changes everything.
That all depends on which God exists. If it's the God of the Bible that exists, then maybe it would change some things. I'd be a lot more terrified of hell, for one thing, because, yeah, if you demonstrate that this God existed, that would make an eternal torture chamber a real thing. But Pascal's wager wouldn't be able to save us there, because as the Bible says, God knows who really worships him and who is only pretending, and I would not be able to genuinely feel love, admiration, or any of the other things you're supposed to feel toward God, because I also have knowledge of the terrible things that this God has done. I can't admire someone who sends people to be tortured for the crime of not admiring him, which would then relegate me to the torture chamber, even if I pretend to admire him. But if it's just a deistic God who set things in motion and then sat back to watch the show, that changes nothing. And there are a myriad of other options as well, which all would have varying degrees on how much or how little it would change my life if I discovered them to be true.
It changes how we look at ourselves, at nature, the world, and the whole universe.
No, not really. Whether or not a God created it, it works in the way that it works, and the way that we look at it is the same. Certainly the way we feel about it might be different, but that feeling is independent of whether or not it is a true statement that God created the universe. And actually, I would suggest that it is irrelevant. People are capable of feeling wonder when contemplating various aspects of nature and science, regardless of their religious beliefs. Though, if you're going to suggest that the things we see in nature were purposely designed, then I have some serious questions for the designer. Because, yeah, when religious people talk about being in awe of creation, they show pretty pictures of landscapes and space and whatnot. But what they don't show are the parasites whose life cycle depends on making other organisms miserable, or the cruel balance where a surplus population of one species will almost certainly be detrimental to the population of another species.
Alright, there's usually three types of people. Number one, God does not exist. Number two, well, I don't know, maybe not, I don't know. Number three, yes, God exists.
That's more than a bit oversimplified. There are subcategories and combinations of each. I know people that will fight to the death over what the meanings of these words are, and while this argument doesn't particularly interest me, it helps when discussing these things to give definitions of how you will be using the word. The thing about labels is that it doesn't much matter what the dictionary says about the label. What really matters is how the people are using it themselves. So with an atheist, there are a couple of differing views. There are people who say that atheists positively assert that there is no God, and there are others who say that atheist just means someone who is unconvinced of the existence of God. Both of these are valid positions, but in a discussion it helps if you figure out which position the person you're talking to holds for themselves. Someone who is unconvinced of your claims is going to be approaching the topic from a different angle than someone who is making claims of their own. Personally, I like to use Gnostic and agnostic as a modifier to the terms atheist and theist to better describe the positions. An atheist who positively asserts that no gods exist is a Gnostic atheist. One who simply remains unconvinced of the theistic position is an agnostic atheist. One who is positively asserting the existence of a god or gods is a Gnostic theist, and one who simply remains unconvinced of the Gnostic atheist claims is an agnostic theist. Personally, I am of the agnostic atheist variety. I don't positively assert that no gods exist, and when dealing with God claims on my channel, I spend my time explaining why I find these claims unconvincing, rather than making counterclaims of my own.
If you're number one, if you tell me, Daniel, God does not exist, I have to tell you that there is no way that you can prove that God does not exist.
Yes, there is no way to prove that the vague concept we refer to as God does not exist. This does not make the existence of such a being plausible, and the more characteristics you assign to your God concept, the easier it becomes to disprove specific God claims. So if you want to bring up the Big Bang or the universal constants, then sure, it is probably impossible to prove that it's not possible for a God to be the cause. But that brings up a lot more questions, and it does nothing to really answer any of our other questions. But as it does get easier to disprove more specific God claims, I personally am rather fond of using the internal inconsistencies in the Bible to demonstrate that God, as presented by the Bible, is not possible. For instance, Proverbs 6 verses 16 through 19 has a list of 6 things that God hates. At least half of them are things that the Bible has, on one occasion or another, recorded God doing: lying, shedding innocent blood, and sowing discord among brothers. And I would argue that he's actually guilty of all 6, being haughty, devising wicked plans, and running to evil. But those 3 are more subject to interpretation than the Bible just outright saying that he does those. Though certain translations do credit God with the creation of evil, so depending on what translation you're using, it's either 3 or 4 of 6. So God hates a lying tongue, and the Bible says several times that God doesn't or can't lie. Yet the Bible also tells of several times where God has lied. God hates those that shed innocent blood, but can it truly be said that there were no innocents among the Egyptian firstborns that God killed? Were there no innocent people at the time of the flood? God also hates those who sow discord among brothers, and on multiple occasions God causes various cities to engage in cannibalism as punishment, but in Deuteronomy 28:54, he specifically says that this will result in even the most sensitive and gentle man not having compassion on his own brother. That sounds like sowing discord to me. Actually, just read through Deuteronomy 28 sometime just to get a feel for the kind of person the God of the Bible is. He spends the first 14 verses describing how he will reward you for obedience, and then spends an additional 53 verses going into great detail about how he will curse you for disobedience. They are usually pretty graphic and gross, but in particular I want to bring verse 30 to your attention. You will be pledged to be married to a woman, but another will take her and rape her. This is the Christian God of love, who, if you fail to obey, he will cause your fiancée to be raped as punishment, whether she was guilty or not. And, of course, only men should be reading scripture, so there's no equivalent punishment of a woman's betrothed being raped or anything. Women are property, they belong to their husbands or fathers, so damaging a woman is fair game in the quest to punish a man. Gross.
There's a huge circle here, right? This is knowledge. This is everything that we know or can know about everything.
Ah, so you went to the Ray Comfort School of Apologetics. Fantastic.
Right? In here you have biology, you have science, you have everything, psychology, everything that you can know about anything.
Yes, okay, the sum of all potential knowledge is in the circle, and what any individual can know is a tiny dot, leaving the vast majority of potential knowledge completely unknown. Speed it up a bit, this one's not supposed to be that tricky.
Is in the circle, all right? Let me ask you this. How much do you know about knowledge? How much of this do you know? Some of you would say, you know, there's so much that we can know, so maybe only this much, right?
Well, that's an arrogant amount. If we are talking about all potential knowledge, I am firmly convinced that it is not possible for our brains to hold on to more than just a tiny little dot.
So this is what you know, and this is what you don't know, but it exists. You just don't know it yet, right? So you say, God does not exist, right? But isn't it possible that God can exist in all the space here that's left?
And again, it depends on how we are defining God. A nebulous deistic God? Sure. I don't think it's likely, but I will admit to it being a possibility. And realistically, we don't know enough to determine whether it even is a possibility. So it is possible that the existence of even the most generalized God is actually impossible, but we just don't know that it's impossible. This is the other side of that knowledge coin. Yeah, we can't say for certain that no God exists outside of our circle of knowledge, but conversely, you can't say that the existence of such a God is definitely possible, as we don't know whether or not it's possible. And then that brings us back to the problem of the definition of God. Remember, the more specific you get, the easier it is to disprove. There being vast quantities of knowledge that we don't know doesn't render everything we think we know uncertain. In base 10, 2 plus 2 is 4, no matter what else we might learn. A being cannot at the same time be love incarnate and punish men by arranging to have their girlfriends raped.
Maybe in another dimension or something, you just don't know it yet. Of course he can. God is almighty. He can exist.
You say he is almighty, but with how little knowledge we have out of the entire pool of potential knowledge, how have you determined that it's even possible for an almighty being to exist in the first place?
So there's no way to prove that he does not exist.
And there is no way to prove that there isn't a little black teapot orbiting the sun between the orbits of Earth and Mars, but that doesn't increase the probability that it's actually there. And actually, starting with our current level of knowledge, we can at least say that it is a physical possibility for a teapot to be orbiting the sun in such a location. We know that teapots exist, we know how orbits work, and we have sent enough stuff in between Earth and Mars that it is at least possible that somehow a teapot was included in one of those missions and was sent off in a solar orbit. All of this is possible. It is incredibly unlikely, but at least we can say for certain that it is possible.
The next one is the universe or creation points to a designer.
Creation points to a creator. Well, the creator certainly did some pointing with his creation when he designed the Finger of God Bach globule. If you hold that God is in control of every detail of how the universe is designed, then you must necessarily be of the opinion that God specifically designed an interstellar dust cloud that looked like it was flipping us off. And if God was all-knowing, then he knew what that would mean to us when we developed the technology to observe it. Not sure what that would say about God, but I certainly find it amusing.
How is it that everything works together so perfectly? We know scientists are telling us that life is balanced on a knife's edge, right?
Yeah, but it's not a nice balance that is kept in line by some super powerful being. It's a balance that is obtained by the death and suffering of any population of organisms that exists outside of that balance.
What does that mean? Now, there's around 50 constants of nature.
I counted 46. Close enough, I guess.
If there was even the slightest change, life would be impossible.
Okay, so I know that you deny evolution because you mention it later on in this video, so you really should not use this argument. The fine-tuning argument doesn't get you to the Christian God. It gets you to a deistic God who set the universe in motion and then left it to do its thing. The whole idea is that the constants were such that as the Big Bang was happening, the clumps of mostly hydrogen were able to condense to form the first stars. And the constants were also such that the stars were able to go through enough of the stellar life cycle to produce the elements that are required by life as we know it. And so we were able to evolve eventually. That's how this argument works. But the thing is, your first point about knowledge works against this argument as well. If your argument is valid that God exists outside of our current knowledge and is in the realm of potential knowledge, then that applies equally here. It is entirely possible that somewhere in the vast quantity of potential knowledge that we do not have, there is a natural reason why the constants ended up where they did that requires no God as the solution. And on top of all that, how have you ruled out the possibility that life could exist with different values of these constants, but that life might look different than the life we have now? If that were the case, then it's entirely possible that the constants could be different, and we would still have life, but that life would be different, and it would be arguing that its universe was finely tuned for it.
And all these constants are independent of each other. So just think, for all of them to have come together points to intelligence behind it. A designer that created it all.
Does it, though? Do we know that life couldn't exist with different constants? Do we know that it's even possible for the constants to be different? How do we know this? Sure, for some of them it could be said that life as we know it couldn't exist, but maybe a different form of life could, and that's just outside of our current circle of knowledge.
Just look at how far the sun is from the Earth.
There's nothing special about that. It is estimated that there are about 40 billion Earth-sized planets in their star's habitable zone in the Milky Way galaxy alone.
And how far the moon is from the Earth.
The possibility that the moon played an integral role in the development of life, again, relies on evolution to be true. Many abiogenesis simulations rely on the water being present but going away in a cyclical manner, something that could be helped with the tidal action of the moon. But it is also possible that the first life formed around geothermal vents near the bottom of the ocean, in which case the moon's role would have been greatly reduced, possibly to the point where it didn't have a role. So the moon may have helped life get started, it also might not have. This bit of knowledge is currently in the unshaded area of your circle, and if it ends up being true, relies on evolution and abiogenesis.
It is just the perfect distance for life on Earth to exist.
Life on Earth has existed for billions of years, and for the vast majority of that time, the moon was much closer. 3.9 billion years ago, the moon was 1/3 of the distance away from the Earth that it is today, so the distance of the moon to the Earth is not critical for the existence of life. And there is quite a bit of wiggle room in the distance the Earth is from the Sun, so that's not entirely critical either. And with how big the universe is and how common Earth-sized planets are in their stars' habitable zones, it is entirely unremarkable that life developed on a planet that meets the criteria for developing life.
We're just hanging here in space. I mean, look at where we are in our galaxy. Our galaxy is the Milky Way. We're just in the perfect spot to allow the right amount of radiation for life to exist.
Do you know what would be more indicative of a creator than us living where it is possible for us to live? Us living where it is clearly impossible for us to live, but somehow we are sustained by the creator. If we think that life evolved naturally without any supernatural intervention, where would we expect to find it? Where it is hospitable to life? This feels rather obvious to me. This whole argument can be rephrased as life exists where it is possible for life to exist, therefore God. It just doesn't follow.
Even if you look at gravity, it has a range of constants, and it is just in the right spot for us to be able to live.
How did you determine that there was a range of different possible gravitational constants? How do you know it could have been any other way? Have you created a scientific model of the universe with these different constants to determine that life would indeed be impossible under different circumstances? Or are you just making assertions without actually having anything to back them up?
And I did not even go into nature yet, where everything is so complex and works together to sustain life.
The complex interactions between organisms are not designed specifically to sustain life. It is a series of evolving offensive and defensive mechanisms where the ones who fail to develop adequate traits for survival are mercilessly eliminated.
I mean, it is so complex that it takes more faith to believe that it is a purely random chance that life came into existence from nothing.
Well, it's a good thing that nobody believes that life came into existence from nothing via random chance, then.
The evidence of God is always around us. The problem is just of how people interpret it.
If it is possible to interpret it in a way that does not exclusively point to a God without misrepresenting it, then that means it was not evidence for God to begin with.
Even scientists. Did you know that scientists get the same facts, but they just interpret it differently based on their beliefs?
Which is why the process of peer review is so important to science. Before publishing, you must submit your research to other scientists to review it, and these other scientists will have different biases. Some may even have reason to want your findings to be wrong. But if they can't find problems with your research, then it goes on to be published. And once it is published, other scientists will then make it their goal to prove you wrong with competing studies. And eventually, after all the problems are hashed out, scientists will come to a consensus. So yes, individual scientists will have biases that lead them to interpreting their data in certain ways, but they don't get to just blindly hold on to these biases. They have other scientists pointing out any errors that are the result of these biases. That's what makes science such a reliable method for determining how the world works, because at the base of it, science doesn't care whether or not you think God is behind it all. It instead focuses on how it all works rather than worrying about who did it. As I've said in previous videos, saying God did it is a useless explanation. Answering the question who done it doesn't do anything to explain how he done did it. If there is a God, then science is the quest for understanding how he did what he did. If there is no God, that changes nothing about science, it just removes the who from the equation.
And that's why some scientists say that creation points to a designer and a God, and others say, well, we don't believe in a God, so they look at facts and interpret it based on their beliefs of evolution.
See? He does deny evolution. Otherwise, there would be no reason to try and divide scientists up into the false categories of those who believe in God and those who believe in evolution.
We exist, and therefore God has to exist as well.
Nope, that does not logically follow.
Now, some of you are like, Daniel, that doesn't even make sense. What do you mean?
He got me. That's pretty much exactly what I was thinking.
Well, let me explain it to you in this way. Let's take the two main beliefs. Some people believe God created us, right? And other people just believe God didn't create us, we just came into existence by ourselves. meaning evolution.
Yeah, kinda. I'm tempted to argue with the wording, but I am curious where this one is going.
Now, if you believe in evolution, you believe that we basically came from nothing.
For the record, that was part of his video. I'm not sure why he felt the need to do that, but to address what he was saying, no, we do not believe that we came from nothing. Okay, I don't know what's going on in this guy's video anymore, but for those of you listening without watching, he now has a graphic up that says, "Interesting because the law of thermodynamics states that you can't get something from nothing," which is not true. The laws of thermodynamics are about the energy of a system and the state of that energy and how it behaves depending on whether the system is isolated, open, or closed. So your real question here is, why did the universe start off in a low entropy state? And sure, we don't necessarily know the answer to that one, so feel free to stuff God into that little gap, but that's all that this is, the God of the gaps. We don't know the answer, so it must have been God.
Now, if you believe in evolution, you believe that we basically came from nothing and there was a piece of matter that just spun really fast and poof, it created everything.
That is one of the worst mischaracterizations of the Big Bang that I have ever heard. Maybe actually do some reading on a topic before making a video explaining why you think that topic is completely ridiculous.
So you believe in the beginning, nothing, piece of matter, and I believe in the beginning, God, powerful God that created everything.
So where did God come from? Why do we have to have an explanation for the singularity and where it came from, but you don't need to have an explanation as to where God came from?
So if I ask you, where does the piece of matter come from? You would tell me, well, I don't know. And you would tell me, okay, so where does God come from? And I would tell you, well, he was always there.
Why couldn't the singularity have always been there? That's one hypothesis, the hartle-hawking state, where the energy and/or matter that made up the singularity existed before time, and so that technically doesn't count as eternal. After all, eternity is a measurement of time, so you can't have an eternal thing without the existence of time. So when time began, that's when all the stuff started happening. Now, it is way more complicated than that, but I don't really understand it well enough myself to try and explain it in great detail. Essentially, if it is correct, then as long as time has existed, so has the energy of the universe in one form or another. So no need for it to come out of nothing. And then there's also the competing hypothesis that, yes, the universe did come out of nothing, because nothing is unstable and can't continue to exist without producing something. And if you add up all the energy of the universe, it appears to equal zero. So the entire universe has a total sum of zero energy, so no physical laws were broken. These are explanations that use math and physics to describe how the early universe would have behaved. These are not perfect explanations, and we don't know which one is correct or if there are other options that are correct, but it's a lot better than dismissing all of modern cosmology with, meh, God was just always there because reasons.
And we say that God was always there, right? You say, but how is that possible? Because there had to be something that created God. I mean, what created God? So, okay, let's take this thought and we think it through, all right? So let's say there was something that created God. And then we would ask, okay, what is this something and what created it? Then we go on and say, okay, this thing had to create this thing. Okay, but then what created this thing? And then you would go back and back and back and back until forever. So the only conclusion that you can come up with is there had to be something there that was always there, all powerful, to start everything and to create it.
Okay, so special pleading. Got it. Everything needs to have a cause, therefore the thing that I propose as the cause doesn't have to have a cause because reasons.
You have matter, but you also need space to put it and you need time to put it as well. And all those three things need to come into existence at the same time for life to be able to be created.
Nope. As I pointed out earlier, one of the leading hypotheses for how the universe got started is that the singularity pre-existed time. There is nothing that says that all three of those things had to be simultaneous in order to eventually lead to life. That's just another assertion with no evidence. And just a cursory glance at some Wikipedia pages on the Big Bang show that you are wrong.
So, matter, space, and time. Evolution cannot answer this problem.
No, because evolution doesn't deal with the origin of the universe, so it's not even trying to answer this problem. The blacksmith doesn't need to explain to you how the iron deposits ended up in the earth before he can make a horseshoe. He just needs to know what to do with the iron once it gets to him. Brief side note, last names often come from occupations, right? So Smith would have been a blacksmith, probably. Goldsmith would have been someone who worked with gold. But what about Sexsmith? Were they just really, really good at sex?
But God did. He answered it in 10 words in the Bible. In the beginning, there's time. God created the heavens, there's space, and the earth, there's matter.
It is so weird hearing those exact words parroted without Kent Hovind's odd cadence.
In the beginning, there's time. God created the heaven, there's space, and the earth, there's matter.
All right, the next one is the moral law. Just hang on there for a second. Thirsty from all this talking. So the moral law, what do I mean? Well, since the beginning of time, every human culture have had a moral law inside of them.
And these moral laws, except for a few basics, have been very, very different from culture to culture. And if you look at the moral law that is laid out in the Bible, we find a law that our culture today believes is immoral. Even the 10 Commandments, the top 10 rules that Christians must follow. Number 4 will blow your mind. At best, half of them are things that we recognize today as moral. Numbers 1 through 3 all basically boil down to believe in the Abrahamic God. Even Christians will usually agree that it's possible for atheists to behave morally, so these 3 are not necessarily moral. 4 is not to work on the Sabbath, which even Christians will often do. They don't call it a moral evil to not have one specific day off. Some do, but most don't. 5 is honor your father and mother. Okay, fine, generally decent advice, but what if you have abusive parents? Should they be honored? I would suggest no. It would be immoral to require a child to honor their abusers. Don't murder. Okay. Don't commit adultery. Depends on the definition. Don't cheat on your significant other? Sure. Don't have sex before marriage, as some have interpreted it? Nope. Don't steal? Okay, I'll agree with that one. Don't bear false witness, which most interpret to mean don't lie. Generally, yes, but there are instances where lies can be the moral option. And don't covet. Well, if we suddenly decided not to covet, then capitalism would collapse, as it is based entirely on desiring things that other people have. Also, the don't covet one, in context, lists your neighbor's wife as one of the possessions that you are not to covet. So right there in the 10 Commandments, the law that we are all supposed to have written on our hearts, it describes women as property. I don't consider that moral, and I imagine that most people in my culture today would agree. And this isn't even getting into the heinousness that is the rest of the law, like the punishing rape victims for the crime of being raped in the wrong location and whatnot.
Well, let me explain it this way. If you're able to see good and evil in the world, then you must assume that there is a moral law where you can know the difference between good and evil.
Why does there have to be a law that is prescribing things as good and evil? To all appearances, what we label good and evil are a matter of our preferences, and these preferences differ from culture to culture and even from individual to individual. Certainly there are things that most people and cultures can agree on, but these can be adequately explained by evolution, empathy, and enlightened self-interest with no God required.
Everyone has a conscience, and it's not just cultural, it's universal.
If this conscience is not cultural, it's universal, then why do cultures differ so much on moral issues? In some cultures, suicide is considered an honorable way to end your life. In others, it is considered cowardly. And in others still, it is a blend of the two depending on the situation. In some cultures, the rights of the individual are held up as being of the utmost importance, while in others, family's priorities are primary. The individualistic cultures look at the family-centric cultures as oppressive and immoral, and the family-centric cultures look at the individualistic cultures as selfish and immoral. That's a strange thing to happen if we are all born with the same moral code.
All right, the behavior of Christians.
So your number one point in your video on the existence of God is the behavior of Christians, a group that is so disparate that they can't even internally agree with each other on who God is. You're supposed to save the best for last, buddy.
Now, there's a lot of people that choose not to believe in God because they don't look at God, they look at Christians. And when they look at Christians, some of you have maybe been hurt by Christians that are very judgmental.
No, it's not about having been hurt by Christians. It's more about how they can't be internally consistent. You'd think that a group of people being led by an all-powerful, all-knowing entity would be unified, but they are not. There are literally thousands of denominations, and they all disagree about who and what God is.
So first, let me make this very clear. Everyone who say that they're a Christian it doesn't mean that they are a real Christian.
Okay, so the no true Scotsman fallacy. Gotcha. Your number one point that we need to know about whether or not God really exists is that some Christians aren't true Christians. I think we can end it here. Sexy Kent Hovind here doesn't really say anything profound in his closing. Today's comment of the day comes to us from the Noob Monster, who says, I just want to say thank you for all the work you put into these videos. They are not simple response videos making fun of creationists, but educational and rhetorical tools. Thank you so much for the comment, I appreciate that. I do try to make my videos educational where possible. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the filament that keeps the 3D printer that is my channel printing, especially Mark McManus. If you'd like to melt inside me before being extruded into something beautiful, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/ViceRhino. You can also support the channel by sending money directly through PayPal, link in the description, or you can get stuff from my Amazon wishlist, link also in the description. Social media links and P.O. Box addresses are also in the description. Everything's in the description. Check the description. See you next time.
Because if there were matter but no space, where would you put it?
Because if you have matter but no space, where would you put it?
If there were matter and space but no time, when would you put it?
And if you have matter and space but no time, when would you put it?
You cannot have time, space, or matter independently. They have to come into existence simultaneously.
See, you cannot have time, space, and matter independently. They need to come into existence at the same time.
The Bible answers that in 10 words.
He answered it in 10 words in the Bible.
In the beginning, there's time. God created the heaven, there's space, and the earth, there's matter.
In the beginning, there's time. God created the heavens, there's space, and the earth, there's matter.
So you have time, space, matter created, a trinity of trinities there.
So you have time, space, and matter, the trinity of trinities created at the same time.
Just, time is past, present, future. Space has length, width, height. Matter has solid, liquid, gas.
Time is past, present, and future. Space is length, width, and height. Matter is solid, liquid, and gas.
And the God who created them has to be outside of them.
And you see, the God that created them had to be outside of them.
If he's limited by time, he's not God.
If he's limited by time, he's not God.
The guy who created this computer is not in the computer. He's not running around in there changing the numbers on the screen, okay?
You see this TV here behind me. The guy who created this TV does not live inside of the TV.